This is Naked Mormonism.
I pledge my life, all that I may have. I will strive to the utmost of my ability to be what you would want me to be.
It's time to find the truth.
And having set our hand to the plow, we will never look back until this work is finished.
Where is the church heading?
I have faith that the Constitution will be saved as prophesied by Joseph Smith. But it will not be saved in Washington. It will be saved by enlightened members of this church.
The explicit tag is there for a reason. So if you get offended at what's said, it's not for you. But most importantly,
may you ponder the truths you've heard. May they help you to become even better than you were.
Skepticize everything.
Welcome to episode 26 of the Naked Mormonism podcast, the serial Mormon history podcast. I'm Bryce Blankenagel, and thank you for joining me. Last historical timeline episode ended on a wee bit of a low note. We discussed a bunch of new missions that Joe had sent everybody on, and the fact that Joe and Emma had their second and third child in one day, who both died a few hours after childbirth. Of course, Emma and Joe adopted the twins Joseph S. and Julia Murdoch, who were the twins of John Murdoch, as if they were some sort of replacement for Joseph and Emma's twins that had just died. After this, Joe, Hinchpin Rigdon, and 4 others went to Jackson County, Missouri to meet up with the remaining small missionary force that was residing in Missouri and still proselyting out there. And of course, that included Ollie Cowdung, Oliver Cowdery. According to the history of the church, many tears were shed at this beautiful reuniting of good old friends. And I made the argument that the tears were shed not only for the long-awaited reunion, but also because of the unbelievable tragedy that Joe had just been through, losing his second and third child in one day. So let's jump right into the meat of this episode, because like usual, we have a lot to talk about. Our timeline currently sits in the fall of 1831. Let's see if we can finish up 1831 and then get somewhere into early 1832 on today's episode. Before getting into the situations that happened, we need to introduce a few new people into our historical analysis. We have to introduce them now because they were baptized into the church in 1831. Even if these people don't really distinguish themselves with anything special for a while, we still need to talk about them and bring them into the timeline here. In June of 1831, Joe announced the high priesthood, not the Melchizedek priesthood, but just the high priesthood. This was the first time that it came up, and it wasn't talked about in reference to Ollie and Joe getting that priesthood in the woods in 1829 after they had received the Aaronic priesthood. Beyond that, another big thing happened in June of 1831. Among other things, William Wines Phelps, or William W. Phelps, or he's sometimes called as W. W. Phelps, or as we'll just come to know him, Double Dub Phelps. He was baptized into the church. This guy was a heavy hitter throughout the entire history of the church, and he ended up following Bloody Brigham out to Utah, and he died there in 1872 at the age of 80. So Double Dub Phelps is known most for writing a selection of Mormon-only hymns. Of course, Mormons use a lot of Christian hymns that are typical to Christianity, but they also have some of their own proprietary hymns. One of these is Praise to the Man, which really is the most Joseph worshipy song in the entire Mormon hymn book. He also wrote If You Could Hide a Kolob, which is a fairly bizarre Mormon hymn about ascending and becoming gods. But more importantly for our timeline anyway, Double Dub was responsible for printing the first Mormon publication in his own printing press in Independence, Missouri, and that publication was called The Evening and Morning Star, in which a lot of revelations were published. So in Double Dub's journey out to Missouri, he passed through Cincinnati, Ohio, and he purchased all of the equipment and typeset that would be necessary to print The Evening and Morning Star, as well as the Book of Commandments in 1833. Luckily, once Dub Dub Phelps got to Missouri with all of the equipment necessary to set up this printing press, Eddie Party Boy Partridge had already purchased a lot in Independence that would house the building that the printing press was set up in. We'll investigate the details of this on our next Historical Timeline episode, but for now, we need to talk about a couple of other new guys that deserve their own name-o nicknames. We already talked a fair amount about D-Day David Whitmer because he was one of the 3 witnesses, and he had a big part in the Book of Mormon coming to fruition. Well, his 2 brothers, Peter Jr. and John, have come up a few times in Revelations and as ancillary characters to our narrative. Well, it's finally time to properly introduce John Whitmer, because he eventually became one of the most important people in church history. Now, that's undoubtedly a tall claim. When it comes to reading about the history of the church, it's always worth noting where the information came from. It may have come from an anti-Mormon newspaper article, or a Believing Mormon's journal entry, or some other less than reliable source. Well, John Whitmer was appointed as the first official church historian. According to his own biography, however, he was somewhat reluctant to do it. But indeed, Joe came up with a revelation saying that he should become church historian, and John fell right into line with God's commandment. This is from the Book of Commandments, chapter 50, verse 1, and it was given in March of 1831. Quote, "Behold, it is expedient in me that my servant John should write and keep a regular history, and assist you, my servant Joseph, in transcribing all things which shall be given unto you." End quote. So that was divine revelation from Joe to John, calling him as the church's first official historian, working directly with Joseph Smith. When we look at sources, when we are studying Mormon history, oftentimes it's a bit of a crapshoot. Sometimes you get some really good historical facts that are posed in a very extremely historically biased presentation. And sometimes the bias is embedded so deeply within the presentation that it's worth questioning the validity of the entire thing. Well, John Whitmer became the church's first real full-time historian, and that means we need to pay a lot of attention to him and what he wrote about the church and its leadership in general. We can scarcely find a more biased reporting of history and current events in the church than John Whitmer, so for that reason, we'll be calling him John Goebbels Whitmer, or just John Goebbels. One need only look a century into the future from 1831 to learn about John Goebbels' namesake. And hey, even better than that, the Whitmer family was German and spoke with German accents. So the nickname kind of, fits better than I initially thought it would. So John Goebbels Whitmer and Dub Dub Phelps were 2 people that we really needed to get caught up with, and now we are. They'd been introduced into the story long before this, and it's now time that they finally made their proper debut onto the show with their very own name-o nicknames. They finally become important enough for us. One more person that is worth briefly mentioning is Ezra Booth. He was one of the first outspoken apostates of the church and one of its earliest motivated critics. Booth was brought into the church in May of 1831 and was called into leadership as an elder on June 3rd of 1831. He was one of the missionaries out to Missouri, and he attended the meeting in Kaw, Missouri that Joe held once Joe, Rigdon, and all the other guys arrived. Ezra Booth didn't really stick around long, so he won't be getting his own name or nickname, but he is an interesting fellow, and he's also credited with the first mention of polygamy by Joseph Smith in 1831. We'll get to that soon, but for now, let's just pick up our timeline and see where it can take us. So after Joe, Hinchpin Rigdon, and Ollie, along with the other elders of the church, held their conference in Kaw, Missouri, a large portion of them made their way back to Ohio, while a couple stayed in Missouri. The church had been fully established there in Missouri, and Joe had seen the prospective land acquisitions the church would be making once it moved out there. The mood around the church was pretty good around this time, and things seemed to be going swimmingly, really. If you read about their visit to Missouri in the History of the Church, Volume 1, page 198, it seems almost euphoric about the situation, and it's completely out of place given the paragraphs before and after this description. Take this, for example. Quote, "The season is mild and delightful nearly 3/4 of the year, and as the land of Zion, it bids fair, when the curse is taken from the land, to become one of the most blessed places on the globe. The winters are milder than the Atlantic states of the same parallel of latitude, and the weather is more agreeable, so that the virtues of the inhabitants only equal to the blessings of the Lord which he permits to crown the industry of those inhabitants. There would be a measure of the good things of life for the benefit of the saints, full, pressed down and running over, even 100-fold. End quote. I mean, it's just so pleasantly optimistic, and yet inexplicable as to why that bit was included. I mean, I can only imagine that John Goebbels wanted to stretch his new historian legs a little bit and write about something other than the insane rabblings that happened to fall out of Joe's skull. So he probably wrote about how great Zion is once he was there. Let's get to one more passage right after that to really get a proper hold of the mood. Quote, "But all these impediments vanish when it is recollected what the prophets have said concerning Zion in the last days. How the glory of Lebanon is to come upon her, the first tree, the pine tree, and the box tree together, to beautify the place of his sanctuary, that he may make the place of his feet glorious. When the splendor of the Lord is brought to our consideration for the good of his people, the calculations of men and the vain glory of the world vanish. And we exclaim, out of Zion, the perfection of beauty God hath shined." End quote. Those passages are completely apropos of nothing that was being talked about before or after them. I mean, it's worth pointing out and discussing because it's almost like reading the main Josephus passage that talks about Jesus, that's known as Testimonium Flavianum. The paragraph before is talking about how many Jews were part of a typical Roman genocide, and then there are these 7 optimistic sentences talking about Jesus that were seemingly plopped in from nowhere, and then after those sentences it moves on to talk about some other problems Jews were having in a very melancholy tone. That's almost how this passage reads in the history of the church. It just seems really, really out of place. Now, we know that most, if not all, of the Testimonium Flavianum was not actually written by Josephus, but was later added by Christians, most likely Eusebius of Caesarea. I wonder if this passage in the history of the church was written by somebody else, other than who is chronicling the other passages before and after those paragraphs. Now, I'm not implying anything sinister like with Eusebius here. I'm not trying to say that there was underhanded authorship that happened, as in the case of the Testimonium Flavianum. I'm just curious if it jumps out to anybody else, and if there's any reason that these passages are included here in the history of the church that just seem like they're so out of place. So, you know, that's, like I said, it was worth pointing out, but it's not really that important in the grand scheme of things. It just seems odd. So moving on from textual criticism, after the church's conference in Caw, Missouri, Joe, Ollie, Rigdon, Doubled Up Phelps, and a bunch of others made their way back to Kirtland, which took most of the month of August to cover. They arrive on August 27th, 1831, and immediately get busy. What happened over the next few months can be summed up in a sentence. Joe is the financial planner of the church, and he needs shitloads of money. Let's look at the next few revelations that came out of Kirtland in August and September of 1831. This is the Book of Commandments, chapter 59, 43 through 50. Quote, "But woe unto such, for their reward lurketh beneath, and not from above. And now I give unto you further directions concerning this land. It is wisdom in me, that my servant Martin, not some smarty Marty, should be an example unto the church in laying his moneys before the bishop of the church. And also, this is a law unto every man that cometh unto this land to receive an inheritance. he shall do with his monies according as the law directs. And it is wisdom also that there should be lands purchased in independence for the place of a storehouse, and also for the house of the printing, and other directions. Concerning my servant Martin, not so smarty Marty, shall be given him of the Spirit, that he may receive his inheritance as seemeth him good, and let him repent of his sins, for he seeketh the praise of the world. End quote. Now, I don't feel like it's terribly necessary to comment on that passage very much, but of course I'm going to. Basically, the church needed money, so Joe came up with a revelation telling everybody that follows to give him some money. Simple as that. He even used his beaten down, wifeless, jobless, landless, and nearly moneyless old pal, not so smarty Marty, as an example to these people, telling him to give every last penny he has to the church, and telling everybody how righteous Marty was, and how he would be blessed as seemeth him good for his faith and willingness to give. And of course, chastising him a little bit for seeking the praise of the world. This petition for money must not have worked when it was given, because very soon after this, we find another revelation telling people to give money to the church, again for the purpose of purchasing Zion. You would think that the Almighty God of the universe would have no need for land ownership agreements. I mean, the God of the Old Testament sure didn't seem to mind much when it came to land ownership, and we'll discuss that in a second. This is from the Book of Commandments, chapter 64. Quote, "And now, behold, this is the will of the Lord your God concerning his saints, that they should assemble themselves together unto the land of Zion, not in haste, lest there should be confusion, which bringeth pestilence. Behold, the land of Zion, I the Lord holdeth it in my own hands. Nevertheless, I the Lord render unto Caesar the thing which are Caesar's. Wherefore, I the Lord willeth that you should purchase the lands, that you may have advantage of the world, that you may have claim on the world, that they may not be stirred up to anger, for Satan putteth it into their hearts to anger against you, and to the shedding of blood. Wherefore, the land of Zion shall not be obtained but by purchase, or by blood. Otherwise, there is none inheritance for you." And just to point it out, I think that Joseph made a mistake in his revelation there, because the next sentence clarifies. "And if by purchase, behold, you are blessed. And if by blood, as you are forbidden to shed blood, lo, your enemies are upon you, and ye shall be scourged from city to city, and from synagogue to synagogue. And but few shall stand to receive an inheritance." End quote. So basically, this was a revelation telling Joe and everybody in the church that they need to purchase Zion, as opposed to going and taking it by blood or conquering, by military force. The Nauvoo Legion wasn't a thing at this point, but there were still a fair amount of armed men that were willing to fight for Joseph, and, well, it could have been fairly interesting, to say the least, if Joseph tried to lead a military coup or a military march to overtake a land in 1831 here. I think arguably he would have been squashed. But just to kind of comment on the broader point here, the last time that David Michael and I were talking, he made a really, really good point to me. You see, it may not be apparent from my lack of knowledge on the Roman Empire or Alexander the Great or the Huns or plenty of other historical figures, but I really enjoy military history quite a lot. David and I get in discussions all the time about history nerd stuff, and it's a lot of fun because I don't really talk to many other history nerds like David. Anyway, the point he made was that Joe was the right guy in the wrong time. What he means by that is Joe seemed to give plenty of revelations that could have been carried out in a very bloody manner in a different time if he wasn't living in 1831. Of course, the post-Enlightenment European settlers of the 19th century United States would not allow a religious tyrant to get too far out of control without answering violence for violence. So Joe was kind of stuck with weak sauce revelations like the one that we just read, telling people to go and purchase lands as opposed to going and taking them by blood. But if we think about it, if Joe were living in like 1150 CE in Temujin Khan's time and place, who knows? He may have just become the next great Khan, or the next Alexander the Great if Joe were living in 338 BCE Macedonia. Joe could have been the next divinely inspired war tyrant, working under direct revelation from God. Now, this may be a rabbit hole or a bit of a tangent, but hang in there for a second. I'm going to draw a larger point here. To introduce this, I love the letter that was sent from Pope Innocent IV to Guyuk Khan in 1245. The letter is this convoluted description of the Catholic faith and Christianity in general. The original letter was full of Godspeak and typical confusing Christian gobbledygook, written in Latin and had to be translated 4 times for the Khan to read it, and it was just weird. By the end of it, it sounds almost like it's trying to call the Khans to repentance, or, kind of inviting them to embrace Christianity or be subversive to the Pope and the Catholic Church. Altogether, if the Pope would have known who he was writing to, or if he would have known the gravity of the Khan Empire, the Mongol Empire, it's very possible that it would have been worded a little bit differently. Because by the end, it's basically a desperate plea to stop killing Christians and taking their lands. This letter marked the Pope trying to gain the fealty of Guyuk Khan by proxy of the Christian God. I find it interesting that most people see their fortune as God-inspired. The Pope thought that his amazing Come to Jesus letter would soften the heart of the almighty ruler and Christian persecutor in the Eastern Steppe, but the Khan sends back a letter that sums up everything so well, and this will get me to the point that I'm trying to make here. If you want to read the letter exchange between Pope Innocent IV and Guyuk Khan, there will be a link to the letters in their original untranslated Latin and Mongolian, as well as their translations to English in the show notes. So the Khan replied to the Pope with a letter containing this as the last few passages. This is kind of a long one, but it really sums up what the Khans were about. Quote, "Furthermore, you have sent the following message," now quoting the Pope, "You have conquered all the lands of the Hungarians and other Christians. This seems strange to me. Tell me, what was their crime?" Back to quoting what Guyuk was saying. "I have also not understood this message of yours. Chinggis Khan and the great Khan Ogadai have both transmitted the order of the eternal God that all the world should be subordinated to the Mongols to be taken note of. But they disregarded God's order to such an extent that those mentioned by you even held a great council, and they behaved arrogantly in refusing, and they killed our messengers and our envoys. Thus the eternal God himself has killed and exterminated the people in those countries. How could anybody, without God's order, merely from his own strength, kill and plunder? And when you go on to say," quoting the Pope, "I am a Christian, I honor God," back to quoting Guyuk, "how do you think you know whom God will absolve and in whose favor he will exercise his mercy? How do you think you know that you dare to express such an opinion? Through the power of God, all empires from the rising of the sun to its setting have been given to us, and we own them. How could anyone achieve anything except by God's order? Now, however, you must say with a sincere heart, 'We shall be obedient. We too make our strength available. You, personally, at the head of the kings, you shall come, one and all, to pay homage to me and to serve me. Then we shall take note of your submission. If, however, you do not accept God's order and act against our command, we shall know that you are our enemies. This is what we make known unto you. If you act against it, how then can we know what will happen? Only God knows." End quote. You see, the Khans were badasses, and they had a much more intelligent and a testable perspective of God than the Christians did. The Khans figured that God was with whoever was the most successful, which is not entirely ridiculous when you think about it. Now, Guyuk Khan told the Pope that the Khans were obviously working with the strength of God. I mean, how could any nation do what the Mongols had done by this point without the help of God? That seems like a fairly reasonable question, doesn't it, based on testable facts? The Mongols had come out on top of amazing battles against incomprehensible odds with minimal casualties. From their perspective, how could they not be doing God's will at this time? If God really is almighty and he didn't want the Mongols killing a bunch of Christians or altogether killing 40 million people or conquering 12 million square miles, why did God let it happen? To put some perspective on that, that's 11% of the world's population and 22% of its landmass, all killed and conquered by one empire, the Khan Mongols. If God didn't want this empire to flourish, then why did it flourish? If the Christian God was the ruler of the universe, why did he allow millions of Christians to fall to the sword of the greatly superior human Mongols? Now let's shift our focus from the Mongols for a second. Think about it this way, from an Old Testament perspective. The only reason that the Hebrews were able to conquer so many cities like Midian, Amalek, Canaan was because of Moses' divine mandate to do so. Yahweh, according to the Old Testament anyway, was responsible for interfering on behalf of the Israelite nomads for almost every battle they encountered. I do have to point out that there's absolutely no evidence of this happening or of Moses even existing, but it's still worth pointing out that the Old Testament God seems to side with whoever was winning in wartime, which it makes sense. It seems to make sense from a believing perspective. The only time we see this rule being violated is in the case of Mormonism. This is a larger point that I'm drawing here. If you are the God of the New Testament, aka the Book of Mormon, speaking through Joseph Smith, then you seem to conform nicely to the laws of the land in early 19th century America. Isn't it weird how that works? Isn't it odd how God tends to operate within the parameters of the society that worships him? Like this God commanding Joseph Smith to purchase the lands in Missouri as opposed to taking them by blunt force, like he had in most other cases in the past. My overall point is this, and this is the point that David made much better than I'm making right now. Joe was the right guy living in the wrong time. He had the divine mandate from his own personal God concept, and he eventually had the armies to raise some serious hell. But he just didn't live in a time and place that was conducive to his behaving in a way like Alexander or the great Khans did. Joe couldn't get away with mass murder like these arguably great men had in the past. The time and place Joe lived in restricted his ability to conquer land by any other means other than legal purchase. This brings us to this larger point here. Given Joe's revelation we just read, not only were Joe's actions restricted by the time and place in which he was living, so was his own personal God. You see, most people act within the confines that the society they live in dictates, and their God usually fits very nicely into that hole. Anybody that doesn't have this harmonization between God and reality is seen as a wackaloon or an extremist to some degree. Anybody who has a personal God belief that is outside the dictates of the time and place they are living in becomes a problem to that society in general, whether it's a completely benign problem like a crazy homeless guy screaming the end is coming on the city streets, or somebody like a Khan or an Alexander, or let's go as far as saying like a Hitler or something. So we can see that Joe's revelations, and by extension his God, operated within the confines of his own society. For now, anyway. Once the Nauvoo years come along, that's when Joe becomes the almighty worldly ruler and king of Israel with very little regard for reality in any way whatsoever. Joe kind of manufactures his own reality. That being said, I would make the argument that Joe or somebody was coming up with these revelations out of their head, as opposed to being divinely inspired. I know that's basically a foregone conclusion given the stance that I usually take on the show, but I still figured it was a point worth hashing out and giving some historical analogies for. So getting back to the meat of the episode here, given this revelation for Joe to acquire Zion through legal means and legal means only, Joe and the church were obviously desperate for some sustainable income. He had people giving when they could, but he hadn't set out an actual rule for it yet. Joe had merely called certain people to purchase certain things and then extended the call to give to anybody else in the congregation that may have been paying attention. This was not sustainable, and sustainability is what the Church of Christ needed the most at this time. Fast forward to September 1831 in the Book of Commandments, chapter 65, quote, "For I, the Lord, requireth the hearts of the children of men. Behold, now it is called today, and verily it is a day of sacrifice, and a day for the tithing of my people. For he that is tithed shall not be burned, for after today cometh the burning. This is speaking in the manner of the Lord, for verily I say, tomorrow all the proud and they that do wickedly shall be as stubble, and I will burn them up, for I am the Lord of hosts." End quote. So that was the first official installation of the law of tithing on the members of Joe's church. With the threat of hellfire, of course. For many obvious reasons, this law of tithing was completely necessary in order for the church to continue to grow. There was absolutely no way for the church to survive without some sustainable income. The LDS Church could survive today if the $7 billion a year that it's pulling in just tithing alone were to dry up, but that's only because of remarkable diversity of investments and a huge umbrella of separate companies that are for profit and financially solvent. I mean, an insurance agency with $3.5 billion in assets isn't really going to go anywhere anytime soon, nor is its mother company. But that's the church today that has a lot of really smart people working for it, a lot of them for free. But Joe's little church didn't have all these billions of dollars in assets and investments and tithing per year. Joe's church didn't have 670,000 acres of cattle ranches and orange farms in Florida like they do now. Joe's church was completely insolvent and was bleeding money until this steady stream of tithes started. Money becomes a bit less of an issue to Joe, at least until the United Firm comes along for a couple of years and then collapses. But until that time comes, we have a brief hiatus of talking about the money part of Joe's early Mormonism. I know we've discussed Joe's begging for money a few times on the show. One would argue a lot, but we can't put it to bed quite yet. I want to draw a circle around this revelation before moving on. The revelations dealing with money that we've talked about on the show are a very, very, very small percentage of the total revelations that Joe gave that relate to or deal with money directly. I have skipped over covering so many of these money revelations just for fear of redundancy. The Book of Commandments and Doctrine and Covenants are filled to the brim with revelations asking people to give money to the church or commanding them to purchase something directly. There's simply no studying Mormon history without pointing out the abundance of revelations regarding money. Risking that redundancy one more time, I just want to point out when this revelation was given relative to seemingly other important revelations. This revelation that put the law of tithing into place was a considerably early revelation. The law of tithing was instated 1 year into Joe's 14-year reign, and before a lot of relevant things in the church. It came along way before the temple ceremonies, baptisms for the dead, the Aaronic or Melchizedek priesthoods, the word of wisdom, the doctrine on Kolob, the basis of leadership roles in the church, polygamy, the quorum of the 12, the secret passwords and handshakes, magic underwears, doctrine on tattoos and piercings, current verse vision accounts, high priests, before blacks couldn't explicitly have the priesthood, before all of this. Now, why is this? Was money the most prominent issue on God's mind, and thus why he gave so many revelations concerning money? I mean, if you think about it, it's understandable from a naturalistic perspective, though, right? If Joe was setting up his own religion for people to follow, there's no possible way to run it without some source of steady income, so he needed to set up that portion fairly early on. The problem comes in when we consider the roots of the church foregoing the naturalistic perspective of its foundation. The church claims that it's the product of the one true church being restored to the earth. The LDS Church claims that it's the product of the one true church being restored to the earth. Now, what that means is they claim that Jesus set up the one true church while he was here, and it was lost during the medieval age, which is why it's called the Dark Ages. Joe merely restored Jesus' one true church to the earth, starting with the Book of Mormon. Now, from this perspective, I find it hard to believe that tithing was the most pressing thing that God wanted people to know about once his church was finally restored to the earth. Especially given the problems that money creates in churches. I mean, most of the early divisions and disagreements in the church were over nothing more than money in what was called priestcrafting. A disagreement about money and priestcrafting is what drove a wedge between childhood friends and cousins Joe and Ollie. Why was it so pertinent for God to restore that one doctrine so early in the formation of Joe's church? Well, hashing out God's reasoning here is a matter of positing a naturalistic versus divine origin for the church. Which side makes the most amount of sense and explains the evidence best? Did God really want people to give tithing before they put on their magic underwear and did all the other things that I listed a second ago? Or did Joe just need money for his early church and came up with these revelations first to answer that need? You decide. All right, now that the money part of Joe's church is out of the way for a minute, we can talk about some of the other important things that happened in 1831. The thing that marks the biggest transition involving Joe was his move out to Hiram, Ohio, on September 12, 1831, the day after the tithing revelation was given. So Joe moved to Hiram on September 12th to live with John Johnson for a short time. He took his young family with him. At this time, Joe and Emma had little Joseph S. and Julia Murdoch, the twins they had adopted, and they wouldn't be having another child of their own for a little while after this. Not long, but a little while. Next, something very interesting happens. But before we talk about this, we need to talk about Joe and his insatiable libido. If we recall back to some of the earliest episodes of the show, Joe was accused of being flirty or maybe even fooling around with Emma's best friend, Eliza Winters. This happened a couple of weeks after Joe and Emma were married and may have been the driving factor behind Joe and Emma moving from Harmony to Fayette. If this wasn't a red flag to Emma, it should have been, and she only had herself to blame for not paying attention or acting on this red flag. The next instance we have of Joe acting a little frisky is in the 1830 trials in South Bainbridge and Colesville. If we recall back to episode 21, we found the court records of those trials, and there was a very interesting detail buried therein. The court was held in recess until the two daughters of bossman Josiah Stowell, named Miriam and Rhoda, could be called onto the stand to testify against Joe on adultery charges. The court really was just trying to charge Joe with anything that would stick at this point. Well, it didn't stick, and Joe was released on the disorderly persons charge as well as the adultery charges. And of course, that was in 1830, 3 years after Joe and Emma were married. So in July of 1831, when Joe and company were in Jackson County, Missouri, he gave a revelation that is considered to be the first signal of polygamy. We only really know about this revelation because of Ezra Booth. He brought it into the white-hot light of scrutiny when he apostatized in a series of 9 publications that he wrote and published in the newspaper. Now, I believe we covered this in a recent episode, so I'll just go over the highlights of this revelation really quickly here. This revelation was given in July of 1831, but they didn't have pen or paper when they were in Caen, Missouri. It was later recounted by our new friend, William Wines, or Double Dub Phelps. Quote, part of a revelation by Joseph Smith, Jr., given over the boundary west of Jackson County, Missouri on Sunday morning, July 17, 1831, when 7 elders vis-a-vis Joseph Smith, Jr., Oliver Cowdery, William Wines Phelps, Martin Harris, Joseph Coe, Ziba Peterson, and Joshua Lewis united their hearts in prayer in a private place to inquire of the Lord who should preach the first sermon to the remnants of the Lamanites and Nephites, and the people of that section that should assemble that day in the Indian country to hear the gospel and the revelations according to the Book of Mormon. So these elders gathered together in, kind of a seance type thing to see if we could come up with some revelation deciding who would be the first person to give a proper sermon to these Native Americans or these Lamanites here. Among the company, there being neither pen, ink, or paper, Joseph Smith Jr. remarked that the Lord could preserve his words as he had ever done till the time appointed, and proceeded, "Verily I say unto you, that the wisdom of man in his fallen state knoweth not the purposes and the privileges of my holy priesthood. But ye shall know when ye receive a fullness by reason of the anointing. For it is my will that in time ye should take unto you wives of the Lamanites and Nephites, that their posterity may become white and delightsome and just. For even now their females are more virtuous than the Gentiles." About 3 years after this was given, I asked Brother Joseph Smith Jr., this is quoting from Double Dub Phelps, privately how we that were mentioned in the Revelation could take wives from the natives, as we were all married men. He replied instantly, "In the same manner that Abraham took Hagar and Keturah, and Jacob took Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah by revelation. The saints of the Lord are always directed by revelation." End quote. This was the earliest account we have of Joe trying to start up polygamy, and it was supposedly given mere months before Joe and Rigdon moved out to Hiram, Ohio. Let's just take a second to step back and appreciate this revelation. Taking the Native American women as wives was arguably the best idea that anybody had to start integrating with the natives. I mean, until this point, most people had been trying to force the Native Americans into slavery, or had been proselyting Protestant Christianity to them, or, when those didn't work like they hoped, the early American government just sort of pushed them out into increasingly smaller reservations, that they called them. And once the reservations idea wasn't quite good enough and the Americans wanted to expand further, they just killed the natives. I mean, hundreds of thousands of Lamanites fell by cannon, gunshot, disease, illness, or malnutrition, and the ones that didn't die were irrevocably relegated to tiny little reservations, most of which were just chunks of land that none of the American government or nobody else wanted. So the government was just like, hey, you guys can live here. Now, I gotta be honest, I'm not one for advocating patriarchal polygyny, especially when it's so rife with abuse and misogyny like Mormon polygamy was, and, the breakoff factions of it are still today. But wouldn't that have been a better solution than killing all the natives or moving them onto these little tiny reservations? I mean, us humans have a very weird tendency to put up imaginary barriers between different looking humans and fight to the death to maintain those barriers. If we just intermingle and try our hardest not to kill each other, it seems like everybody would be better off. I think Joe was onto something here. He just wanted to marry a bunch of really hot Native Americans. He even said that they were more, what did he say? They were more virtuous than the Gentiles. But I think that he was right. Integrating with them anyway, as opposed to just killing them. Even if he was right for the wrong reasons in this case. If we could rewind the clock 400 years and not kill almost all the Native Americans, imagine how enriched American culture would be today. It's really hard to make a cogent argument against how great that would have been. If only we didn't have their deaths as the unnecessary byproduct of an us versus them mentality. Joe kind of had the right idea, but like I said, he had the right idea for the wrong reasons. He just wanted to get with a whole bunch of hot natives. That's just my personal perspective on the situation. So, take it or leave it. That's just me, my own speculation. So let's get back to the main topic here. Joseph issued this polygamy revelation in mid-1831, and then by September, he had moved to Hiram, Ohio to live with the Johnson family on their 300-acre farm. Since then, the church has purchased the farm and refurbished the home, and it's currently a tourist attraction in Hiram, Ohio. Now we need to introduce some other people into the mix. Joseph didn't just show up on some random guy's doorstep and ask to live with him. That's just absurd. The Johnson family had acquired a Book of Mormon in the winter of 1830, possibly early 1831. We're unsure. Once Joe rolled into town, never to look back to New York, John and Mary Elsa Johnson took their family the 30 miles north to Kirtland to see what the fuss was about. So we'll be talking about John and Mary Elsa Johnson here a lot, but Mary Elsa Johnson, she just went by Elsa. So anytime that I say Elsa Johnson, that is the Johnson mother, and John is the Johnson father. So John and Elsa, as well as Lyman Johnson, who was John and Elsa's son, converted and were baptized in February of 1831. Lyman's brother Luke Johnson was baptized very soon afterwards on May 10th of 1831. And during this few-month period, the entire Johnson family was converted. So it wasn't just these, it wasn't just John, Elsa, Luke, and Lyman. It was all of them. So while the Johnson family is fairly important to Mormon history, John and Elsa themselves don't play a very big role. They were merely the older couple that housed Joe and Rigdon during an important time in Mormon church history. The family members that we need to focus on are John and Elsa's sons, Lyman and Luke Johnson. These boys have a very sordid past with the church, and there were even rumors that the Danites may have killed Lyman in 1859, sometime after his excommunication. But those are all details to be hashed out on another episode. For the purposes of today's episode, let's talk about what happened in the Johnson home. First off, we need to discuss the occurrence that made the Johnsons and a few others believe that Joseph was a real prophet. I'm going to take this directly from the History of the Church, Volume 1, page 215. The story is recounted in the footnotes for some reason, yet only bore a brief mention from Joseph himself in his own history. It's originally recounted in a Campbellite work titled Hayden's History of the Disciples on page 250, but I'm reading it out of the footnotes of the History of the Church. You would think that if this were such a miraculous occurrence that convinced a lot of people that Joseph was indeed the one true prophet, that Joe would have talked about it at least somewhat briefly, but he didn't. He just mentioned it. So because of that, it's necessary to dive into outside sources and then put them into the footnotes of the History of the Church, which is where I'm reading this from. Starting page 215 of Volume 1, quote, Mrs. Johnson had been afflicted for some time with a lame arm, that's Elsa, and was not at the time of the visit able to lift her hand to her head. The party visited Smith partly out of curiosity and partly to see for themselves what there might be in the new doctrine. During the interview, the conversation turned on the subject of supernatural gifts, such as were conferred in the days of the apostles. Someone said, "Here is Mrs. Johnson with a lame arm. Has God given any power to men now on the earth to cure her?" A few moments later, when the conversation had turned in another direction, Smith rose and, walking across the room, taking Mrs. Johnson by the hand, said in the most solemn and impressive manner, "Woman, in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, I command thee to be whole," and immediately left the room. The company were awe-stricken at the infinite presumption of the man and the calm assurance with which he spoke. End quote. It goes on to say that Mrs. Johnson returned to work the next day without any trouble or pain, and this signifies one of the earliest miracles that Joseph supposedly performed, second to Newell Knight's exorcism. Yet, for some reason, Joseph didn't really seem to recall it when he was dictating his own history in 1838 that we read that from. I personally find it odd that we had to go to a non-Mormon source to find the story of Joe's healing powers that convinced a lot of people in Hiram, Ohio to join the church. It just seems odd. Now, regardless of where we find this miraculous healing scenario, this was the one main thing that convinced the Johnson family that Joe was a real prophet, thus spurring them to join the church. Well, the whole Johnson family joined. We had John and Elsa Johnson, and their children were Lyman, Luke, John Jr., Olmsted, Eli Edward, and finally Miranda Nancy. I'm having trouble finding any more offspring of John and Elsa. I believe they did have more children than that, but without diving into hours of research, trying to find their family tree, these are the important names that we'll need to keep in mind for our timeline and for today's episode. Once Joe had moved to Kirtland in 1831, he began mustering up quite a stir. One of the people that Joe had a dramatic impact on was named Philo Dibble. I'm going to read an excerpt from Philo's autobiography that describes the series of events that we are currently discussing. This is from Philo's own personal autobiography. Quote, "When Joseph came to Kirtland, his fame spread far and wide. There was a woman living in the town of Hiram, 40 miles from Kirtland, who had a crooked arm, which she had not been able to use for a long period. She persuaded her husband, whose name was John Johnson, to take her to Kirtland to get her arm healed. I saw them as they passed my house on their way. She, meaning Elsa Johnson, went to Joseph and requested him to heal her arm. Joseph asked her if she believed the Lord was able to make him an instrument in healing her arm. She said she believed the Lord was able to heal her arm. Joseph put her off till the next morning." What a gentleman. "When he met her at Brother Newell K. Whitney's house." That's where Joseph was living at the time, in the apartment above the Bishop's storehouse that was the Whitney trading post in Kirtland. "There were 8 persons present. 1 a Methodist preacher and 1 a doctor. Joseph took her, Elsa Johnson, by the hand, prayed in silence a moment, and pronounced her arm whole in the name of Jesus Christ, and turned and left the room. The preacher asked her if the arm was whole, and she straightened it out and replied, 'It is as good as the other.' The question was then asked if it would remain whole. Joseph, hearing this, answered and said, 'It is as good as the other, and as liable to accident as the other.' Of course. The doctor who witnessed this miracle came to my house the next morning and related the circumstance to me. He attempted to account for it by his false philosophy, saying that Joseph took her by the hand and seemed to be in prayer, and pronounced her arm whole in the name of Jesus Christ, which excited her and started perspiration, and that relaxed the cords of her arm. I subsequently rented my farm and devoted all my time to the interest of the church, holding myself in readiness to take Joseph wherever he wished to go." End quote. So here we have Philo's reaction to this miraculous incident, and it was the second first-hand account we have of the arm healing incident, which means it's fairly reliable as a historical occurrence. Of course, on a personal level, I don't think Joe did anything different from what Peter Popoff used to do with his mega church ministry and continues to do with blessed mineral water on late night ads. I mean, and honestly, Popoff is only one of countless other faith healers that have caught public attention and have made millions from it. People have been performing these spiritual healings for millennia, and the results are nothing but a mixed bag of ritualism, placebo effect, chemical reactions happening in the brain, all ruled by confirmation bias. That seems to be the one recurring theme behind these healings: prior belief. Joe even asked Elsa the day before if she believed that he could heal her arm for her. Well, or that Jesus Christ could heal her anyway. Then Joe took her arm in his hand and commanded it to be healed in the name of Jesus Christ, playing even further into Elsa and Joe's confirmation bias. And then Elsa thought she was healed or didn't experience pain for a while or something to that effect. This convinced a lot of people that Joe was indeed a prophet. And the after effect of this is we have Philo saying that he subsequently rented my farm and devoted all my time to the interest of the church. I mean, what more could Joe want than more loyal servants willing to give him time, money, and resources to his church? Joe looks more and more like Popoff the more that I study him, especially in occurrences like this, performing a faith healing miracle, quote unquote miracle, to get people to join his church. And, you know, from Philo's recounting of the situation, I love how there's also a doubting Thomas in the crowd that watched Joe perform the miracle. According to Philo, he spoke with the doctor that was present during the miracle. Apparently there was a Methodist preacher and most of the Johnson family and this doctor. And of course, this doctor was understandably perplexed at the faith healing, much like modern doctors are when somebody claims to be healed by divine intervention today. Faith healing is undoubtedly an odd phenomenon that educated people are studying quite a bit and have been studying for decades. Some doctors try to incorporate that aspect into a regimented medical procedure for like kind of a whole body wellness or something like that, which I think is great, but it doesn't really help to directly study the effects of faith healing. But it is something that we're working on. And that whole body wellness is something I can get on board with. When we have people like Peter Popoff that are saying, don't go to a doctor, God is burning that thyroid condition or that cancer out of your thyroid, or he's straightening out your vertebrae or whatever Popoff claims, that's when it becomes a very, very, very big problem. That's when faith healing really starts to become a detriment to society. I mean, drawing a line between Popoff and Joe here, the simple fact that Joe put his hands on an old lady and told her that our arm is healed doesn't necessarily mean that it was healed. It just means she didn't feel pain in it for a while. There was never a follow-up with dear old Elsa to see if her arm was healed in the long term. It was just that day and the next day she didn't have pain in it. All right, I have to be honest. Please excuse me there. That was a terrible way to explain or try and skepticize faith healing. But for the purposes of what this show is, that's plenty to satisfy my own skepticism and understanding of it, and, you know, what Joseph claimed was a miracle, or what these other people claimed Joseph performed as a miracle. So let's move on to the rest of Philo Dibble's quote and let him carry the storyline into late 1831. Quote, on invitation of Father Johnson of Hiram, Joseph removed his family to his home to translate the New Testament. This was in the year of 1831. At this time, Sidney Rigdon was left to preside at Kirtland and frequently preached to us. Upon one occasion, he said, the keys of the kingdom were taken from us. On hearing this, many of his hearers wept. And when someone undertook to dismiss the meeting by prayer, he said praying would do them no good. And the meeting broke up in confusion. End quote. All right, so what the hell happened here? Once Joe left Kirtland to live in the Johnson home, 30 some odd miles south of Kirtland in Hiram, Ohio, Hinchpin Rigdon was left to his own devices and began preaching contrary to Joe's teachings. We've seen how this has worked out in the past. This period in Mormon history is loosely referred to as Rigdon's Depression. So Hinchpin preached in Kirtland that the keys were lost. That's a very interesting operative phrase there. The keys were lost. For any Nevermos out there, that is a really, really big deal. It's taught in the church even today that every man gets the priesthood, but he's given different keys to the kingdom based on his calling in the church. So a bishop has different keys than a patriarch. A first counselor has different keys than the bishop himself. It's just a matter of what office you're called to and what keys you're given in the kingdom. So Rigdon preaching that the keys had been taken implied that Joe wasn't a true prophet anymore. This was the biggest insurrection in Mormon history up to this point. Before now, we had little schisms like that Hubble woman that claimed she to be a prophetess, or Wycombe Clark and Northrop Sweet breaking off to start the pure Church of Christ, but all of those schisms were minor and were just members that felt wronged by the church or Joe in some way and just decided to start their own stuff. This new bit of insurrection was the biggest problem that Joe was to face up to this point, and it was against his own friend and co-founder of Mormonism, Sidney Rigdon. Let's find out how Joe dealt with the problem. Compliments of Philo Dibble Dabble. Quote, Brother Hiram Smith came to my house the next morning and told me all about it, and said it was false, and that the keys of the kingdom were still with us. He wanted my carriage and horses to go to the town of Hiram and bring Joseph. The word went abroad among the people immediately that Sidney Rigdon was going to expose Mormonism. Joseph came up to Kirtland a few days afterwards and held a meeting in a large barn. Nearly all the inhabitants of Kirtland turned out to hear him. The barn was filled with people, and others, unable to get inside, stood around the door as far as they could hear. Joseph arose in our midst and spoke in mighty power, saying, now quoting Joseph, quote, I can contend with wicked men and devils, yes, with angels. No power can pluck those keys from me, except the power that gave them to me. That was Peter, James, and John. But for what Sidney Rigdon has done, the devil shall handle him as one man handles another. End quotes. All right, let's just let that sink in for a minute here. Rigdon preached something that was contrary to what Joe was preaching. This was really nothing new to Joe. He'd been dealing with insurrection like this for a while, even with his earlier second-in-command, Ollie Cowdung. But from his second-in-command, Hingepin Rigdon, this time, that was unheard of. Upon hearing Rigdon had said such horrible things, Hiram Smith, who's Joe's older brother, borrowed Philo's horses and carriage to go pick up Joe from Hiram, Ohio, and bring him up to Kirtland to put out this new fire that had just ignited. Joe gathered a barn full of people and told them that Rigdon was inspired by the devil to say such blasphemies. Then this is the part we need to focus on here. Joe finished it off saying that Rigdon would come into some unfortunate circumstance very soon. I mean, he said the devil shall handle him as one man handles another. So that was either a gay joke or telling that something bad was going to physically happen to Rigdon here. So let's find out what happened from Philo. He tells us about a woman telling Rigdon what Joe had said, but I can't find any reference to this specific circumstance happening anywhere than in Philo's recounting here, and it's a third-hand account, whereas the rest of this story is attested multiple times. So after telling what the woman said to Rigdon, something very important happens, and we'll pick up there. So Philo said, quote, Thomas B. Marsh's wife, so that's where the third person account comes in. It wasn't Thomas B. Marsh saying this. It was somebody saying that Marsh said that his wife said, went from the meeting and told Sidney what Joseph had said, and he replied, is it possible that I have been so deceived? But if Joseph says so, it is so. End quote. So this is the quote that, like I said, I couldn't find anywhere but here in Philo's own account. Now, I honestly don't know if Rigdon said that, said, oh, maybe I'm deceived, and Joseph said that it's right, or if Marsh's wife even went to Rigdon in this case. Like I said, we don't have any other extant evidence of that quote, but we do know for a fact that what Philo recounts next really did happen. Quote, about 3 weeks after this, Sidney Rigdon was lying on his bed alone. An unseen power lifted him from his bed, threw him across the room, and tossed him from one side of the room to the other. The noise being heard in the adjoining room, his family went in to see what was the matter, and found him going from one side of the room to the other, from the effects of which Sidney was laid up for 5 or 6 weeks. Thus was Joseph's prediction in regard to him verified. End quote. All right. I'm not sure how to take this exactly, but I have an idea in my mind of how it all went down. You can feel free to come to your own understanding of this circumstance, but I will give you my synopsis as I understand it. For starters, I honestly, sincerely think that Joe kicked the living shit out of Rigdon. I really do believe that. Joe was a scrapper, which we'll discuss later in this episode, but his entire growing up life up to this point, he had been in various fights, much like other kids did growing up in that time. The thing was, Joe was tough and damn good at fighting and standing his ground. We should also remember that Joe had a knack for predicting harm coming upon people a little while before said harm happened. Take Lilburn Boggs, for example. Should I say Governor Lilburn Boggs? This guy signed the Mormon extermination order, and Joe said that harm would befall him. A little while later, we can't account for Orrin Pistol Pack and Porter Rockwell's whereabouts, and amazingly, Boggs was shot by a shotgun. Joe seemed quite prophetic in the claims about Lilburn Boggs, and possibly in the claim about Rigdon as well, and his prophecies that he gave in these circumstances did not disappoint. So, forgive me if this seems like anti-Mormon propaganda that I'm trying to spread or something, or it seems like it's unfounded in some way, but I think it is reasonable to assume that Joe pretty much beat the hell out of Rigdon. which laid him up for more than a month, as Philo recounts at 5 or 6 weeks. That was a beating. So let's take into account the circumstance that may have caused Rigdon to be displeased with Joe and motivated him to say such horrible things about the modern day prophet. Picking up in 1831, Joe had rolled into town, took over Rigdon's congregations, demanded money, then went to Jackson County to preach to the natives, claiming that the leaders of the church should take them to wives to lighten up their skin and make them a more white, delightsome, and just people. After that, Joe came back to Kirtland and asked more people for more money. Then he instated the law of tithing to ensure he would always have a steady stream of income. In doing this, Joe was exploiting all of the work that Rigdon had done in bringing together the congregations in Mentor and Kirtland. Rigdon seemed like he was putting forth this noble effort while Joe was just coming in and trying to ride on Rigdon's coattails. Joe had been claiming Rigdon's ideas and revelations as his own for a very long time, and now that Rigdon and Joe were working on the inspired translation of the Bible, Rigdon may have wanted more credit. Maybe this marked the first instance that Rigdon was trying to take back his church from the ravenous clutches of his frenemy Joe. Arguably, Rigdon was merely contending with the monster he created, so maybe he just didn't want to sleep in the bed he made. Maybe this is why Rigdon was depressed during this time, and it's referred to as Rigdon's depression. He didn't like the direction the church was going, or that Joe was taking the church, and he wanted to bring it back to what he'd spent so much time and energy building. As soon as Joe was gone for a little while, separated from Kirtland by 30 to 40 miles, Rigdon tried to convince some people that Joe wasn't the one true prophet, and, well, Joe took care of the problem in a way he was very familiar with. Now, I know in recounting that I made a few jumps in the historical narrative there, but I hit on a lot of the very important points that, understandably would have spawned contention between Rigdon and Joe. And let's just face it, all of these pressures could have served as the impetus for Rigdon's insurrection here, or why he was preaching against Joe. But I must be clear. That summary was speculation, trying to find a naturalistic perspective for how Rigdon suffered such a horrible physical beating. I think that it makes sense, and that's my perspective. I think that Joe beat up Rigdon because Rigdon was trying to incite insurrection against Joseph. But I suppose I have to entertain the other side, that it could have been God on Joe's side and the devil on Rigdon's side, so God beat the fuck out of Rigdon to teach him that following the devil is a bad. You figure it out. Which perspective makes the most amount of sense? Let's talk about Philo for a second before we discuss Rigdon moving to Hiram, Ohio, where Joe was living with the Johnsons. Philo joined the church in either October or November 1830, baptized by P.Q. Parley P. Pratt during the first westward mission of the church. This was the same mission that Hinchpin Rigdon supposedly was converted during. Philo was a land dealer, or as we might call him today, a real estate agent, or possibly a land mogul. We're not sure. This man definitely wasn't hurting for money before Joe came along. When Joe first moved to Kirtland, he lived for a very, very short time on the farm of Frederick G. Williams, or as we know him, Freddie G. Willie. Joe lived there for possibly a week or something, but he found out that the farm was $400 in debt, and Freddie Willie was about to lose it. Now, $400 in debt back then was enough to sink a person. That was nearing bankruptcy. After a few things transpired that tried to save the farm, Philo ended up selling 1,200 acres of his own land at $1.25, and he paid Freddie Willie's debt. Philo was quite clearly a great guy, and he stayed with the church until his death in Springville, Utah in 1895. His autobiography is known in church history as, quote, Early Scenes in Church History, subtitled 4 Faith-Promoting Classics, end quote. Apologists and Mormon historians like to dabble into his autobiography from time to time, like to tell the story about Elsa's arm being healed by Joseph, or to, tell an inspiring or motivating story to some prospective missionaries. this Philo guy was just a genuinely nice guy, meaning we can't give him a mean nickname like Not So Smarty Marty or something. So for the purposes of our examination and giving all important characters a proper nickname, we'll go with Philo Dibble Dabble from now on. Primarily just because it's fun to say. Dibble Dabble did this. Dibble Dabble did that. So let's get back to the timeline here. Seemingly, we had Hinchpin Rigdon trying to strip Joe of his leadership claims. You know, that's the way that I'm reporting it, and that's the way that makes the most amount of sense in my mind. Anyway, effectively, he was trying to take the wind out of Joseph's profit sails. You can spell profit either way there. Rigdon got some sense knocked into him, and then him and Joe reconcile their differences and head out to Amherst, Ohio, where they would be a general conference. With a number of missions that were active in a lot of places throughout New York, Ohio, Missouri, and touching some other states, there were occasionally members in some of these outer-lying towns that had big enough homes to hold a conference in. Now, when we think about conferences that the church holds today, it's nothing like the conferences that Joe and Rigdon were holding in various places. Church conference today is held in a 21,000-seat cathedral, a vastly different version of conference than it was in 1832. Most of the time, the conferences back then were just a couple of families gathered together in a living room to hear what the prophet had to say. So in February of 1832, a family in Amherst, Ohio held a conference. Soon after this conference, Joe and Rigdon were preaching in Ravenna, Ohio, a mere hop, skip, and a jump from Amherst and Kirtland. And after this, Joe and Hinchpin made their way back to Hiram, Ohio. And this is the time that they both go crazy on the inspired translation of the Bible for a few weeks. They were either translating John or Revelation at this time. I'm not completely sure, but they were really cranking away. This was nearing the end of the inspired translation. They had done all of the Old Testament up to this point. But that's not all, because something else that comes out of Hiram, Ohio during this time are an assload of new revelations. When Joe and Hinchpin Rigdon got together without much outside stimulations or distractions, they really busted out the revelations. One of these revelations told Joe and Double Dub Phelps to compile all the existing revelations into one book and call it the Book of Commandments. We'll call this edition of the official church revelations the Joe Years, for a few reasons. Everything in the Book of Commandments up to this point had been a fairly clinical take on the new religion. Most of the revelations were fairly pragmatic at this time. Almost every one of them claims that Joe is indeed the one true prophet of God and speaking for God. And, you know, it's what David, Michael, and I call the caller ID, because it was just like, I am the Lord your God, blah, blah, blah. And, you know, of course, a lot of these revelations claim that some people should go on missions to different places and pair them up 2 by 2. One of the main unique revelations that came about during this time was the Current Doctrine and Covenants, section 20. This tells us about all kinds of important leadership things that were needed to establish a pecking order or a power structure within the church. Interestingly enough, this revelation was actually given by Ollie Cowdung Oliver Cowdery. That means that the more mundane and repetitive revelations were given by Joe, and one of the main revelations used in organization of the church was actually given by Joe's second in command at the time, Ollie. Isn't that fascinating? You see how Cowdung can just pop in and pop out like that without anybody expecting him? It happens a lot through a lot of revelations, and actually through some of the Book of Mormon too, thanks to textual criticism and writing styles. We know that for a fact. This same phenomenon of Joe not being the creative one shone brightly once him and Hinchpin spent a lot of time in the same house together. The main revelation that is so paramount that came out of this time in Hiram, Ohio, is the Current Doctrine and Covenants, section 76. Now, most believing members will know that section 76 holds a lot of revelations that set Mormonism apart as the weird ones. If you want to learn all about crazy Mormon heaven, sun, moon, and stars, hell, and all, D&C 76 is where you need to look. It's one of the longest revelations and was obviously given in multiple settings, which is made apparent by the writing style. Given how it's written, it seems that the revelation was written in smaller sections and then pieced together later on, like it was given in multiple sittings. It is worth noting that it required Rigdon and Joe to be away from the sense of the real world in order for some of these more unique and certifiably crack-ass revelations to come out of Joe's deranged skull. Or was it Rigdon's deranged skull? Hang in until the end of this episode for a fun little treat that I recently stumbled upon. I'll leave it up to you to decide if these revelations came from half-assed Joe himself or puppet master House of Crazy Pants Hingepin Rigdon. The next thing we need to talk about is Joe's education. I mean, that may seem like a weird place to go given everything we've talked about today, but it's necessary. You see, Joe received an education similar to what most people got in his day. He attended a few years of legitimate structured school here and there, and he maybe had the equivalent of a 5th grade education at best. So Joe's education was a bit different than what we consider an education today. Now this may seem like a tired phrase, but clearly Joe went to the school of hard knocks. He was smart enough to always be learning from people, but it occasionally came at a cost. Here's when we need to talk about it. Joe was a hell of a scrapper alpha male type because he was so educated in fighting his siblings, friends, and foes alike. Most young men were just like this in this day. I mean, Joseph was not unique. Our upbringings today are much different than what Joe and company experienced in their formative years. Well, Joe was about to get a proper lecture in the School of Hard Knocks, and we're going to use historical empathy to put ourselves in Joe's shoes. We're going to read his own lecture notes very soon, right from the history of the church. It's rather fascinating to see it dictated from Joe's perspective, and it really helps us to get into his shoes and see it through his eyes when it was happening. But before reading that, we need to understand the context a little better. We know that Joe dealt with a fair amount of persecution on many different levels. He went to court a few times for being a disorderly person, which can mean a great number of things, but generally meant that people didn't like what he was doing when it came to business practices, or, as an impartial observer might term it, constantly fucking various people out of small amounts of money. But Joe didn't stop at money. In one instance, it almost seemed like people were angry at Joe for getting a little hanky-panky with bossman Josiah Stovall's daughters. That's why they called him to the stand to testify against Joe. I mean, these people were so pissed off about what Joe was doing and just who he was in general, and they were trying to catch him with any legal technicality that would stick at this time. But Joe's disorderly person and adultery charges were never proven in court, so, of course, from a believing perspective, nothing must have happened and Joe must have been a stand-up guy. There must be no basis whatsoever for these allegations and for these lawsuits. Earlier, I mentioned Joe's insatiable libido and how much it got him into trouble. I mean, shit, it's what he died for. He blew up the printing press in Nauvoo because he didn't want people to know about how much pipe he was laying. Well, the arguments can be made that he was about to learn another lesson from the School of Hard Knocks as consequenced by his all too frequent bumpin' uglies. Remember when I said that the whole Johnson family converted after Joe healed Mother Elsa's arm? Pay attention to the Johnsons in the story we're about to read from the history of the church as dictated by Joseph Smith. This is starting on page 261 of Volume 1 of the History of the Church, and it starts talking about some recent apostates, as well as Joe and Emma's adopted twins, Joseph S. and Julia Murdoch Smith. Just a heads up, the actual passages in the history of the church is censored, but I can't help it. I'm going to fill in those blanks myself for just entertainment purposes only. Quote, this is a long passage, hang in until the end, and then we'll dissect the whole thing at once. In addition to the apostates Ezra Booth and Simmons Ryder, Eli Johnson, Edward Johnson, and John Johnson Jr. had apostatized. On the 24th of March, the twins mentioned before, which had been sick of the measles for some time, caused us to be broken of our rest in taking care of them, especially my wife. In the evening, I told her she had better retire to rest with one of the children, and I would watch the sicker child. In the night, she told me I had better lie down on the trundle bed, and I did so, and was soon after awakened by her screaming murder, when I found myself going out of the door in the hands of about a dozen men, some of whose hands were in my hair, and some had hold of my shirt, drawers, and limbs. The foot of the trundle bed was towards the door, leaving only room enough for the door to swing open. My wife had heard a gentle tapping on the windows, when she took no particular notice of, but which was unquestionably designed for ascertaining whether or not we were all asleep, and soon after the mob burst open the door and surrounded the bed in an instant, and, as I said, the first I knew, I was going out of the door in the hands of an infuriated mob. I made a desperate struggle, as I was forced out to extricate myself, but only cleared one leg, with which I made a pass at one man, and he fell on the doorsteps. I was immediately overpowered again, and they swore by God Almighty they would kill me if I did not be still, which quieted me. As they passed around the house with me, the fellow that I kicked came to me and thrust his hand all covered with blood into my face, and with an exulting hoarse laugh, muttered, "God damn ye, I'll fix ye!" They then seized me by the throat and held on until I lost my breath. After I came to, as they passed along with me about 30 rods from the house, I saw Elder Rigdon stretched out on the ground, whither they had dragged him by his heels. I supposed he was dead. I began to plead with them, saying, "You will have mercy and spare my life, I hope." To which they replied, "God damn ye, calling your God for help. We'll show you no mercy." And the people began to show themselves in every direction. One coming from the orchard had a plank, and I expected they would kill me and carry me off on the plank. They then turned to the right and went on about 30 rods further, about 60 rods from the house, and 30 from where I saw Elder Rigdon into the meadow where they stopped. And one said, "Simmons, Simmons," meaning, I suppose, Simmons Ryder, pull up his drawers, he will take cold." Another replied, "Ain't you gonna kill him? Ain't you gonna kill him?" When a group of mobbers collected a little way off and said, "Simmons, Simmons, come here." And Simmons charged those who had hold of me to keep me from touching the ground, lest I should get a spring upon them. They held a council, and as I could occasionally overhear a word, I supposed it was to know whether or not it was best to kill me. They returned after a while, when I learned that they had concluded not to kill me, but to beat and scratch me well, tear off my shirt and drawers, and leave me naked. One cried, "Simmons, Simmons, where's the tar bucket?" "I don't know," answered one. "Where 'tis, Eli's left it." Eli Johnson. They ran back and fetched the bucket of tar, when one exclaimed with an oath, "Let us tar up his mouth." And they tried to force the tar paddle into my mouth. I twisted my head around so that they could not, and they cried out, "God damn ye, hold your head still. Let us give you some tar." They then tried to force a vial into my mouth and broke it in my teeth. All my clothes were torn off me except my shirt collar. And one man fell on me and scratched my body with his nails like a mad cat, and then muttered out, "God damn ye, that's the way the Holy Ghost falls on folks." They then left me, and I attempted to arise, but fell again. I pulled the tar away from my lips so that I could breathe more freely, and after that, whereupon I saw 2 lights. I made my way towards one of them, and found it was Father Johnson's. When I came to the door, I was naked, and the tar made me look as if I were covered in blood. And when my wife saw me, she thought I was all crushed to pieces and fainted. During the affray abroad, the sisters of the neighborhood had collected at my room. I called for a blanket. They threw me one and shut the door. I wrapped it around me and went in. In the meantime, Brother John Poorman heard an outcry across the cornfield, and running that way met Father Johnson, who had been fastened in his house at the commencement of the assault, by having his door barred by the mob. But on calling to his wife to bring his gun, saying he would blow a hole through the door, the mob fled, and Father Johnson, seizing a club, ran after the party that had Elder Rigdon, and knocked down one man, and raised his club to level another, exclaiming, "What are you doing here?" When they left Elder Rigdon and turned upon Father Johnson, who, turning to run toward his house, met Brother Poorman coming out of the cornfield. Each supposing the other to be a mobber, an encounter ensued, and Poorman gave Johnson a severe blow on the shoulder with a stick or a stone, which brought him to the ground. Poorman ran immediately towards Father Johnson's, and arriving while I was waiting for the blanket, exclaimed, "I'm afraid I've killed him." "Killed who?" asked one. when Poorman hastily related the circumstances of the encounter near the cornfield and went into the shed and hid himself. Father Johnson soon recovered so as to come to the house, when the whole mystery was quickly solved concerning the difficulty between him and Poorman, who, on learning the facts, joyfully came from his hiding place. My friends spent the night in scraping and removing the tar and washing and cleansing my body, so that by morning I was ready to be clothed again. This being the Sabbath morning, the people assembled for meeting at the usual hour of worship, and among them came also the mobbers, vis-a-vis Simmons Ryder, a Campbellite preacher and leader of the mob, one McClintock, who had his hands in my hair, one Streeter, son of a Campbellite minister, and Philatia Allen, Esquire, who gave the mob a barrel of whiskey to raise their spirits. Besides these named, there were many others in the mob. With my flesh all scarified and defaced, I preached to the congregation as usual, and in the afternoon of the same day baptized 3 individuals. The next morning I went to see Elder Rigdon and found him crazy and his head highly inflamed, for they had dragged him by his heels, and those 2 so high on the ground that he could not raise his head from the rough frozen surface, which lacerated it exceedingly. And when he saw me, he called to his wife to bring him his razor. She asked him what he wanted of it. He replied, "To kill me." Sister Rigdon left the room, and he asked me to bring his razor. I asked him what he wanted of it, and he replied he wanted to kill his wife, and he continued delirious some days. The feathers which were used with the tar on this occasion, the mob took out of Elder Rigdon's house. After they had seized him and dragged him out, one of the banditti returned to get some pillows, when the woman shut him in and kept him a prisoner some time. During the mobbing, one of the twins contracted a severe cold, continued to grow worse until Friday, and then died. The mobbers composed of various religious parties, but mostly Campbellites, Methodists, and Baptists, who continued to molest and menace Father Johnson's house for a long time. Elder Rigdon removed to Kirtland with his family, then sick with the measles, the following Wednesday, and on account of the mob, he went to Chardon on Saturday, March 31st. End quote. All right. Like I said, that was a long quote. I hope you hung in there with me for the whole thing, but I wanted to get the whole thing in and then talk about it afterwards. So we have a lot of wrap up and a lot of covering that story, and that will get us all the way to that little something extra that I promised that will finish out the episode. Let's start out by discussing the names that Joe had told us about in the mob. First, we had Ezra Booth. Now, Booth is a very interesting fellow in that he was the first guy to make mention of polygamy in the church merely months before this. He was also the first big apostate. He was the first guy in a leadership position that actively apostatized and wrote quote-unquote, anti-Mormon literature, primarily talking about Joe's polygamous intentions with the natives, given that polygamy revelation. That revelation that we talked about earlier that was recounted by Dub Phelps, that was actually initially brought to light by Ezra Booth and his apostasy. Of course, Dub Phelps merely recalled it from his own memory a little while later. So Ezra Booth is definitely a character worth mentioning in this context, and a fascinating individual at that. In that list that began with Booth, it also listed Simmons Ryder. This man has a fairly interesting story that can more or less be covered in a paragraph or two. Simmons had heard a Mormon woman make a prophetic claim that the city of Pekin, China would be destroyed soon. 6 weeks after he heard this revelation, Ryder picked up a newspaper article that told of a major earthquake that had destroyed a large percentage of Pekin. Now, to be clear, in all of my researching, I could not find a single record of this actually happening, but nevertheless, Ryder saw this newspaper article as divine providence and thus joined the church a little while after his friend Ezra Booth did. Now, Ryder and Booth were good friends. Let's keep that in mind. So Ryder was called on a mission by Joe, but he didn't go on that mission because God spelled his name wrong. Simmons Ryder is spelled with Y's where one would expect I's, and Ryder thought that Almighty God of the universe would never make such a mistake as to misspell his name in a divine revelation. I mean, I can kind of agree with him. To this day, his mission call is in Doctrine and Covenants section 52, verse 37. It is still spelled wrong, as it was in the history of the church where I just read it. That was Ryder's main red flag when it came to Joe and why he didn't embark on this mission. That's why Ryder supposedly apostatized, and it's used by believing members and as a point of teaching. It's one of the main stories that motivates people to say, "Oh, why did you leave the church? Was it did somebody offend you? Did somebody say something that you didn't like?" And they use this guy Simmons Ryder as an example because he according to their narrative, he apostatized because God made revelations with spelling his name wrong with I's instead of Y's, where it should have been Y's. So, I mean, I can understand his reasoning behind this, but I think there was a lot more to it. I think that was just one big red flag that he was like, "Oh yeah, okay, yeah, Joe is full of shit." So soon after Ryder had received his mission call, Booth came home from his mission to Missouri, and both of these men lived in Hiram, Ohio at the same time. When these two old friends met up, as the story goes, they both asked each other, "How's your faith?" And from how it's written, it sounds like they were both incredulous. At that point, they both knew that they had the wool pulled over their eyes by Joe, and they both set out to correct the wrongs somehow. That's why both of them are mentioned here and why both were in the mob that dragged Joe out of the house and tarred and feathered him. And the next people listed in the beginning sentence were Eli Johnson, Edward Johnson, and John Johnson Jr. Does anything ring a bell with those young men? Well, they were John Johnson's sons, and didn't buy Joe's thinly veiled bullshit when he was selling it. Lyman and Luke Johnson stayed in the church, and Luke even died in Utah, having served his entire life in the church. However, the other Johnson boys didn't quite fall for Joe's shenanigans, and they converted with the rest of the family in early 1831 after Joe had healed their mother's arm. But by this time, a year later, after that occurrence, they had given up all semblance of holiness and piety that Joe was trying to portray. Now, I have a theory why these men were included in the mob, but let's talk about the actual occurrence before I propose this theory. Just to be clear, this theory is by no means original. People have thought this for a long time, but that will be discussed after we deconstruct this fateful night of March 24th, 1832. To start us off, Joe and Emma had been taking care of little Joseph S. and Julia Murdoch Smith, who were both sick with the measles. They were just shy of 11 months old at this time. Emma went to bed with Julia, taking care of her, while Joe took little Joseph S. to bed with him on the trundle bed in the living room of the Johnson house. Soon after dozing off with little Joseph Murdoch in his arms, Joe awoke to a dozen men rushing into the house, with Emma screaming in the background. The group of men dragged Joe outside, first by the hair and then by grabbing his limbs so he couldn't struggle free. Joe was able to free up one leg and kicked a man with it, inflicting enough damage to make the man bleed. After Joe inflicted this hit, the mob was sure not to let Joe get any footing or let any of his limbs free. Now, I said earlier that Joe was a scrapper, and this just goes to show how hardcore he really was. He said, quote, "Those who had hold of me kept me from touching the ground, as they had done all the time, lest I should get a spring on them," end quote. Probably because it was true. The mob knew that if Joe could get any sort of advantage on him, he would exploit it, and he may overpower a couple of them and run away. So the group of men dragged Joe about 500 feet from his house, stripped him naked, and discussed what to do with him. Joe looked over and saw Rigdon laying on the ground, covered in tar, supposing him dead. Here, a small detail comes into play that Joe sort of left out. This was written by Luke Johnson, and it's a very important small detail, and it was recounted in an 1858 publication of the Deseret News. And just to be clear, Luke Johnson died in Utah, having been a faithful member his entire life. Quote, "While Joseph was yet at my father's, a mob of 40 or 50 came to his house. A few entered his room in the middle of the night, and Carnet Mason dragged Joseph out of the bed by the hair of his head. He was then seized by as many as could get a hold of him, and taken about 40 rods from the house, stretched on a board, and tantalized in the most insulting and brutal manner. They tore off the few night clothes that he had on, for the purpose of emasculating him, and had Dr. Dennison to perform the operation, implying castration. But when Doctor saw the prophet stripped and stretched on the plank, his heart failed him, and he refused to operate. End quote. We'll talk about that in a minute, because it implies premeditation and an act of passion by the mob here. Upon stripping Joe naked and attempting to castrate him, the mob decided to feed him some hot tar, but Joe wouldn't allow the tar paddle to get in his mouth. Instead, the mob tried to feed him a vial of poison, thus breaking one of Joe's teeth in the mix. From this point on, in the church history, it's not talked about, but Joe had a very subtle lisp because of that broken tooth. So somehow in the mix, the vial broke and didn't end up going down Joe's throat, which is good because it probably would have made him very, very ill for a long time. And Joe had a lot to do after this beating, so that would have put a damper on his efforts a lot. Once the mob had failed to kill or castrate Joe, one man went into Rigdon's house to grab a couple of pillows for the feathers. It's recounted that a woman trapped this man in the house for a moment, but I assume that's referring to Phoebe Rigdon, who was Hinchman's wife. While this was going on, the mob scratched Joe like a mad cat and beat him. And about that time, the man got free from the woman's house in Rigdon with pillows in hand. John Johnson came running out of the house to help Rigdon and Joe. He ran up to the man that were beating on Rigdon, and he swung his club at one man, hitting him, and probably doing a fair amount of damage. After this, the mob presumably turned on John Johnson, forcing him to run back towards his house, where Emma was undoubtedly inconsolable, thinking the mob was killing her husband right now. As John Johnson made his way back to the house, a man named John Poorman, in an effort to help Joe and Rigdon, thought that John Johnson was part of the angry mob. It was in the middle of the night, and you see a man running towards a house with screaming children and a weeping Emma in it. You're probably going to assume the worst. So Poorman intercepts Johnson and hits him with a rock or a stick or a hammer or something very painful, sending Johnson to the ground. It was reported that Poorman hit Johnson in the shoulder, but you wouldn't suspect you killed somebody hitting him in the shoulder with a rock. If you hit him in the head and knocked him out, it might be a little more understandable. Anyway, once Poorman struck Johnson, he realized what had happened, and he basically ran and hid in the shed, thinking that he had killed Johnson, his friend, his good friend. So the man came back from Rigdon's with the pillows and coated the tar-covered Rigdon and Joe with feathers, and at that point the mob disbanded. Joe came to consciousness and walked his bruised and scratched body to the Johnson house, where Emma saw him covered in tar and, thinking it was blood, fainted straight away. That night, the Johnsons and some other friends spent hours scraping off the cooling tar from Joe and Rigdon's flesh. Now, when tar cools, it tends to harden, adhering very solidly to whatever surface it's on. That means that when these people were pulling the cooling tar off of Joe and Rigdon, it was peeling off layers of skin at the same time, leaving their skin tender and bleeding. I can't imagine a worse night than cleaning up after something like this. The day following this incident was Sunday, wherein Joe was smart enough and able-bodied enough to preach to the Hiram, Ohio congregation. This was one of the smartest things Joe ever did in his entire career. With any given religion or cult, there is a correlation between religious persecution and growth in size and membership. A religion needs the perfect amount of persecution in order to flourish. But if there's too much persecution, the religion suffocates under the pressure. Well, if a religious leader is able to use that persecution to light a fire under the collective asses of the parishioners, they instantly feel validated, and that leader has a lifetime worth of followers. Imagine the speech that Joe gave on the stand after he'd spent the night getting beaten up and subsequently more damaged from the removal of the tar these people had thrown on him. He must have stood up there, skin red and raw, chunks of hardened tar still on his face and all throughout his hair, pounding the pulpit, saying, "These apostates and anti-Mormons will never take us down. The Church of Christ will not go quietly into the night. It will set at defiance man and his God for generations to come." You know, I'm just paraphrasing, of course. And the persecution complex is made real for the rest of the entire Mormon religion. the church just sort of tends to leave out the possibility that this whole night all could have been due to Joe's rapacious lust for younger women. I remember being a young child watching movies depicting the faceless mob that dragged the Holy Prophet out of his house and tarred and feathered him. You can see this depicted in the Legacy movie called Joseph Smith, the Prophet of the Restoration. It's free on YouTube. Look it up. Minute 25 depicts what we're talking about here. And yes, there will be a link for it in the show notes. Watch the whole movie if you can stand it. I recently tortured myself with it, and exactly 0 out of 100% of me enjoyed it. The church uses this persecution to further their message all of the time. And it works beautifully. This is a great example of a religion needing the perfect concoction of religious persecution and missionary work in order to thrive. And the Mormon church had it. It was fertile ground that the church sprang out of. So after Joe stood in front of this congregation, raw and bruised and covered in chunks of tar, he went to see how Hinchpin Rigdon was faring the next day. Apparently, the mob had dragged Rigdon out by the heels, bumping his head against the frozen ground for the whole time they were dragging him, causing his brain to swell. We know that Rigdon wasn't necessarily mentally stable before this, and this incident certainly couldn't have helped. I'd also like to point out that what happened is a bit of a callback to Rigdon's childhood. If we remember from episode 14, Rigdon's brother gave testimony stating that Rigdon at a young age fell off of a horse and caught his leg in the stirrup. The horse dragged Rigdon for quite some time with his head bouncing against the dirt and rocks on the ground, possibly even getting trampled by the horse a couple of times. His brother said that Hinchpin was never the same after this. We also know that Rigdon was prone to trances and occasional seizures, possibly due to this childhood accident. So Rigdon being dragged by the mob here in 1832 with his head bouncing against the ground for almost 500 feet must have been at least a little bit reminiscent of his childhood accident. When Joe went to see him, Rigdon's brain was probably swollen. According to Joe's description, he said he was inflamed and fevered, so I can assume that there was some brain damage or something there. Once Joe got there, Rigdon asked his wife Phoebe for his razor for the purpose of killing Joe. He, of course, asked Joe for a razor to kill his wife Phoebe after that as well, but I want to focus on this for just a second, him wanting to kill Joseph. Let's think about it for just a minute. It's understandable that Rigdon was fever crazed and arguably brain damaged when this was happening, which can cause a person to have homicidal thoughts very easily. But let's try and understand this from a naturalistic perspective. I mean, beyond just having possible brain damage. Let's take a step back for a moment here. Why did the mob attack Joe in the first place? It's way too easy to default to calling it religious persecution, even though that's what the explanation has been ever since it happened. But was there something more to it? Earlier in the episode, I listed off the names of the Johnson family that converted to Mormonism in 1831. Well, one of the names listed was Marinda Nancy Johnson. She would later come to be known as Marinda Nancy Johnson Hyde Smith Hyde. Those last 4 marriage names are chronological. I think she actually only ever went by Marinda Hyde. So Marinda's story is quite interesting in that she married Orson Hyde. And then in typical Joe fashion, Joe sent Hyde on a mission to Jerusalem and other places for 3 years, during which Marinda married Joe twice, once in 1842, once in 1843. Once Orson Hyde returned, he took her back as his wife while marrying 2 other women soon after, thus the name Marinda Nancy Johnson Hyde Smith Hyde. Those were all of her marriage names in chronological form. To get back on board with the story, Marinda was 16 when Joe moved into the Johnson household with Emma and the twins in mid-September of 1831. Joe was 26. Now, there isn't really any tangible evidence that we can point to in order to properly assert that Joe and Marinda had a very special night together, but we can consider the character of Joe, look at the evidence, pay attention to the names of the people that were part of the mob, and draw a line between the dots. At least 2 of the people in the mob were the brothers of Miranda Johnson, and they wanted to castrate Joseph Smith. They even had Dr. Dennison on hand to perform it, implying that it was premeditated. They had planned that out long before it happened, and it was an act of passion. You don't castrate a man just because he claims to be the one true prophet of God. You castrate him because he fucked your 16-year-old sister. That's really simple. Now, I have to clarify here. This is all up to conjecture. I'm merely speculating on the circumstances and, like I said, drawing a line between the dots. We don't have any smoking gun proof that Joe and Miranda went toe-to-toe in 1832. And we have it on good authority that they had a good old time in 1842 during the Nauvoo years. But in this specific instance, we don't have any tangible proof. But really, what more do you need? I mean, do we need to attempt to perform a semen sample test on a century-old corpse? Do we need to find Joe's teeth imprint on Miranda's shoulder to prove they were engaged in passionate bed shaking? The smoking gun evidence simply doesn't exist here, as much as we would like it to. But we do know Joe's character, and we know that he got around a lot, especially in the Nauvoo years. We know that there had been multiple accusations from multiple people in different locations claiming that Joe was a frisky sumbitch, and it eventually got him killed in Carthage. And then, to top it all off, we have Miranda's brothers wanting to cut Joe's balls off. I'll ask again, what more do you need for evidence? Is it any mystery why Rigdon wanted to kill Joe too? I mean, Joe's balls effectively elicited Rigdon's most horrible beating of his entire life, and his brain was swollen from physical damage and a fever brought on by said swollen brain and the measles. That can drive any man to want to kill another man, much less the man that was responsible for the beating in the first place. It wouldn't even require the implied brain damage to want to kill Joe at this point, or at very least try and break off, which, talking about what happened earlier in this episode, it seemed like Rigdon was trying to do, distance himself from Joseph. So to close out this episode, let's follow in that vein. Let's really talk about Hingepin Rigdon and bring in that special little something that I promised earlier. Leading up to the time that this bad night occurred, Joe and Rigdon had been working tirelessly on their inspired translation of the Bible. By this time, they were in the New Testament, possibly working on the book of Revelation or John or something. In addition to the Bible, they were coming up with all kinds of amazing revelations, including some that are considered to be the most distinguished revelations that make Mormonism its own religion, as opposed to just another repackaged Christianity. This is a list taken from LDS.org about the revelations that came around during the 6-month period from September 31 to April 32. If anybody listens to the My Book of Mormon podcast, they've heard David and I reading the Doctrine and Covenants during the Joe years. The revelations are so boring and repetitive, saying the same exact things in slightly different ways over and over again. Well, this is a list of revelations that are really unique and tend to stand out from a lot of the other revelations contained in the Doctrine and Covenants. And this is just a quick list. I'm going to give a brief synopsis of each section. So we had section 1. A committee was to draft a preface for a collection of revelations to be published as the Book of Commandments. When they made their report, they requested the prophet Joseph Smith inquire of the Lord about their work. Then we have section 65. This section, designated by Joseph Smith as a prayer, was given during the period the prophet was preparing to recommence translation of the Bible. 67, at the conferences regarding the publication of the revelations that had been given through the prophet Joseph Smith, some of the brethren felt that the language in the revelations was inferior. This was the Lord's response given through the prophet, so just a correction, basically, section. Section 69, Oliver Cowdery had been appointed to carry the manuscripts of the Book of the Commandments and some church funds to Independence, Missouri, because the wilderness was often hazardous. John Goebbels Whitmer, as we call him now, was called as a traveling companion. Section 71, Ezra Booth had apostatized and wrote 9 slanderous letters printed in the Ohio Star. 74, this revelation was received during the translation of the Bible as an explanation of 1 Corinthians. 76, the prophet Joseph and Sidney were translating the Bible. When they came to John 5:29, the heavens were opened and they received this revelation known as the vision. And that's the main one that I wanted to focus on, is section 76. It's so unique in comparison to many, many, many other of the revelations. So just keep that in mind. Eventually, David and I will get to that and we'll hash it all out. But it's a humdinger of a revelation that brings a lot of new things into Mormonism that people didn't know anything about before that revelation. We have section 77. During the translation of the book of Revelation, the brethren had many questions about the writings of John. 78, the prophet instructed the priesthood leaders concerning the law of consecration and establishing a storehouse for the poor. That was the bishop's storehouse. So those are just a small number of the revelations that were given during this 6-month period. This was a magical time in the history of the church. Rigdon and Joe together in harmony, producing amazing revelations that set Mormonism apart from all the other off-the-wall Christianities that were cropping up all over New America at the time. There is one main question I want to ask. Is there something more to this time that Hinchpin, Rigdon, and Joe were working together? If you read any of the revelations that I just listed off, you can see that some of them are a fair amount more mystical and spiritual than the others, especially section 76. Let's get to that treat that I've been promising for a little while now. After Joe died in the Carthage shootout, Hinchpin Rigdon set out to form his own congregation, colloquially referred to as the Rigdonite sect. Rigdon led his church by revelations that he was constantly spouting off until he died in July of 1876. Unfortunately for everybody, when Rigdon was on his deathbed, he told his wife Phoebe to burn everything, and she did. There is no telling what amazing things were lost in that one selfish act. Maybe even a marked up and heavily edited manuscript found was in there. We will never know. But luckily for us, Rigdon sent copies of his revelations to various people to direct the actions of his church, which was called the Church of Jesus Christ of the Children of Zion. I kind of fooled you there. You thought it was going to be of Latter-day Saints. No, of the Children of Zion. The main person he sent these revelations to was a man named Stephen Post, who was a very active member in a leadership role in Rigdon's church. After Rigdon died, Post actually took over the church for a couple of years. So Post collected all of the revelations that he could and then compiled them together, and that collection is currently held in the University of Utah archives. I'm going to read a little excerpt from that collection of over 100 individual revelations. This is from the revelation of the Rigdonite Church, given January 1st, 1874, almost 30 years after Joseph Smith was dead. To provide some context, Rigdon is channeling a dead prophet in this revelation. A dead prophet, kind of like Moroni. Here we go. Quote, "Behold," right? Yes, behold. It starts with behold. "I am Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, who was the son of Aaron, and according to the law and the power of the holy priesthood, which priesthood has power as ministering angels, when they maintain their priesthood in the flesh during all their fleshly existence in purity. I, Phinehas, being of the high priesthood, and having been adjudged by the courts above as one who had honored the holy priesthood during all my days, I obtained the privilege and power of ministering to those in the flesh who had obtained and were consecrated to the priesthood. Therefore, I, Phinehas, speak to you, my son in the priesthood, as a father to his son, knowing the character of your calling and solemnity of its influence, and the manner in which you will be assailed by the devices of the adversary, that he may bring you under condemnation and cast you down at his feet, to preserve the priesthood of this church from being overcome by the devil. The Lord of Zion has given a law, the strict obedience to which will shield them against the subtle artifices of Satan and enable them to overcome the devil, the world, and the flesh." End quote. And it goes on and on and on like that. Chapter after chapter, divine revelation after divine revelation from the Almighty God. Rigdon produced these almost constantly after starting his own Rigdonite church in 1856. It's odd, but a similar writing style that was present in Joe's Mormonism was also present 12 years after his death in Hingepin Sidney Rigdon's church. Now, this seems to lead us to a couple of damning questions. Who was really coming up with these revelations once Joe and Rigdon were able to sequester themselves away from the world for a short time? Was it Joseph Smith, who was convicted for being a fraud? Or was Sidney Rigdon more of a hingepin piece in Mormon history than he's been given credit for? That's it for the historical portion of this episode. Let's move on to Patreon appreciation real quick here. Had a couple new NAMO juvenile delinquents to thank. We had Bill and Rachel. Bill, Rachel, thank you both very, very much for your support. I deeply appreciate it. Next was a couple of new NAMO adolescent rebels. We had Tracy and Jonathan. Thank you both very, very much. That helps out a lot. Every single dollar helps, and you guys did double the dollar, so thank you very, very much. Next, we had a couple of NAMO apostates to thank. We had James, Joseph, and Howard. Great name, by the way, Joseph. I mean, great name for all you guys. I really, really appreciate that. That's a huge point of support. You guys are fantastic. Thank you very, very much for supporting that much with the show. Really goes a long ways to help out, make sure the show continues coming every 2 weeks. And then finally, there were a couple of new NAMO demons. We have Philip and Michelle. Philip, Michelle, you are both amazing, amazing people. Some of the most honorable hominids I can think of. Thank you very, very much for your support. How much you guys are helping out with the show, just any level of monetary help is just absolutely amazing. And thank you all, demons, so much. That's where this show really keeps the sustainable income coming in. That's how I'm able to do this full time. How I'm actually able to put so many hours into this is the support of all of the demons out there, and just the support of all of the patrons out there. So just from the very bottom of my heart, thank you all so very, very much for supporting the show and going on a Patreon and really, showing that you are enjoying the product that's out there. And for all of the people that are sending in emails, especially patrons that are sending in emails and sending in recommendations and corrections or things that I need to work on, or just saying that they are enjoying the show, especially if you're patrons, thank you all so, so very much. I have a deep level of gratitude for anybody that's willing to interact with me or interact with the show or is willing to discuss things that are fascinating or will help out in some way. So to everybody that stays in contact with the show and supports it, just thank you so much for doing what you do and for being who you are. Just wanted to do a quick update here. The GoFundMe is going fantastic. It's received a couple of donations even after it's met its goal, and that's really, really helpful, really fantastic. Currently, I'm working in on that first book, and it's getting bigger and uglier and crazier every day that I work on it. And when I say uglier, I just mean more cumbersome, more challenging to work with. It's just a monster of a book. So I'm working on it a lot, and I'm also working on a new project that I don't want to divulge any details on it quite yet because it's not quite ready, but it's something that I want to incorporate into the book when it actually ends up coming out. So be keeping an eye out. I think next episode I'll announce that new project, and we'll just kind of go from there. One thing I did have to mention, I did a couple of guest spots on other shows, one of which was on the Phil Ferguson show, episode 153, I believe, and then the other was on Country Fried Deep Thought. I'm not sure which episode. If you want to hear me on either of those episodes, either of those shows, you can go and find them on Stitcher or iTunes. There will be links to those shows and episodes in the show notes of this episode. I guess that's everything. Before finishing up today, I need to thank a few people. Start off by thanking David Michael for lending his voice for the intro. If you'd like to have your voice featured in the intro in your blog or podcast or group plugged, you can find the script on the website. Simply email an MP3 of you saying those clips and it will be included in the show. Thank you to all the patrons who support the show. If you'd like to be as awesome as them, you can go to patreon.com/nakedmormonism to sign up to make a per episode donation. If you can't afford a couple of bucks a month, you can always help out the show a bunch by going on iTunes, Stitcher, or your podcast app of choice and leaving a 5-star review for the show. It only costs a couple of minutes instead of a couple of bucks. Thank you to everybody that shares the show through Facebook, Twitter, and other social medias. If you want to get in touch with me directly, email nakedmormonism@gmail.com, and I'll try to answer your questions during the next listener mail segment. Check out the show notes and a lot more information about the show on nakedmormonismpodcast.com. Thank you to Demonista for working hard on the Facebook page and keeping it fresh and rich with content and lots of exciting conversation. Thanks to Jason Camo for his talented musical stylings that are used in this show with permission. For more of his amazing music, you can go to aloststateofmind.com. From me, Bryce Blankenegel, I would like to especially thank you, the listener, for lending me your ear. I hope to talk at you next time here on the Naked Mormonism Podcast. Welcome back there. We haven't done one of these in a long time. Been a little while since I've included a nice little bonus. This is something that I just happened upon in various studying and books and things. So early in this episode, we had the conference that happened in Kaw, Missouri. After that, the missionary troop, including Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith, spent the following month of August 1831 going back from Missouri to Kirtland, Ohio. The company ran into a bit of a problem in doing this little journey. It's abundantly clear that revelations were given just out of need of some sort. Like, something would happen, and then for some reason a revelation would come about that was very timely and apropos of what was happening, and then that revelation seemed to solve that problem. Well, I want to read to you guys a little something that I found in The Rise of Mormonism by H. Michael Marquardt. And this is on page 266. I'm just going to read it straight through. It's kind of funny, actually. Quote, on August 9th, 5 days after the church conference held in the land of Zion, Joseph Smith and a number of elders left Independence and used canoes to travel on the Missouri River as they returned to Kirtland, Ohio. On the 11th, about 100 miles from Independence, the canoe in which Smith and Rigdon were riding in almost capsized as it ran into some wood, and those aboard could have drowned. William Phelps, as we know him, Double Dub Phelps, in an open vision by daylight, saw the destroyer in his most horrible power ride upon the face of the waters. Others heard the noise, but saw not the vision. They stopped for the night at a location known as McIlwain's Bend. In the morning, Joseph received a revelation telling the group of the dangers of traveling on the river. And I'm going to read this revelation. It's pretty fucking fantastic. It's in the Current Doctrine and Covenants, section 61 or chapter 62 in the Book of Commandments. Quote, but verily I say unto you, that it is not needful for this whole company of mine elders to be moving swiftly upon the waters. Really? So not everybody has to be on the water? Oh, that's awfully convenient. Whilst the inhabitants on either side are perishing in unbelief. Oh, there's a justification. We shouldn't ride on the waters because there's other people out there that we could meet while we're walking that need to hear the gospel. Of course, it makes perfect sense. Behold, that there are many dangers upon the waters, and more especially hereafter. For I, the Lord, have decreed in mine anger many destructions upon the waters, yea, and especially upon these waters. I love it. Joe was afraid of the water, so he came up with his revelation. Oh, we're not supposed to be in the water because God made the waters bad and there's destructions there. Nevertheless, all flesh is in mine hand, and he that is faithful among you shall not perish by the waters. Of course. So you won't drown if you're faithful. You just spring up gills. If you're about to drown and you believe in God, you're going to survive. Behold, I, the Lord, in the beginning blessed the waters, but in the last days by the mouth of my servant John, I cursed the waters. Why would you do that? What an asshole. Wherefore the days will come that no flesh shall be safe upon the waters. And it shall be said in days to come that none is able to go up to the land of Zion upon the waters, but he that is upright in heart. End quote. I love it. And I gotta make this clear. So Joseph said, the water is evil. Apparently John cursed the waters, or God cursed the waters through John. I'm not 100% sure. It doesn't make it very clear. So the waters are only going to get worse and worse and worse. And then by the time that Zion is built, people won't be able to travel on the water there because of global warming or I don't know what. But after these instructions were given, this is going back to quoting from The Rise of Mormonism, after these instructions were given, Smith, Rigdon, and Oliver Cowdery went by land to St. Louis and then took a stage to Kirtland, arriving there in August 27th. While in Jackson County, Sidney Rigdon was commanded to write a description of the land of Zion in an epistle and subscription to be presented unto all the church to obtain monies. Okay, so that's not important. But what is important is, Sidney Rigdon and Joseph Smith were in a canoe and it tipped over and they probably thought that they were going to drown. So Double Dub Phelps saw the destroyer riding upon the face of the waters. And then coincidentally, this was the revelation that Joseph Smith, or Sidney Rigdon, received the next morning. Smith, Rigdon, and Cowdery all were too scared to go back into the water, so they hired a coach. The justification that Joseph gave in the revelation for not riding swiftly upon the waters was so that they can meet people that are dwindling in unbelief, and then they hop on a stagecoach that takes them straight to Kirtland. And Joseph said that the waters are cursed, and just those 3 took the stagecoach. Everybody else, the other 7 guys that were headed back, still went in canoes on the water. It's so amazing. You see how these revelations are just kind of born out of necessity? Necessity is the mother of all revelation. God, I love the church history so much. There's always something pertinent that happened in the history that is, just hilarious, like this revelation. It's just beautiful. All right. Just had to throw that little bonus in there. I hope you enjoyed it. Because when I read about it, I couldn't stop laughing. Anyway, see you later.